In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you one of my favorite tips that's been a game changer in my own watercolor work. Once you see this tip in action, I think it's going to become a part of your own practice as well. First, I'm going to show you a simple demonstration of how to use this, and then I'll show you how I use it in a more complex piece. My name is Jessica. I'm so glad to have you here. Let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just lightly sketch out a few petals here. I'm going to do them in slightly different positions so that I can share a few techniques with you. And then I'll sketch a leaf as well, so that you can see how this works in action. Now this is where my game-changing tip comes in, and that is to work with two brushes. What I like to do is have a brush that's slightly larger. In this case, I'm using a round number 8 as well as a round number 6. And I'm going to keep the 8 loaded with water, and the 6 is going to be for my paint. Just tap things off with a paper towel. And first I'm going to show you what a difference it makes when I'm working wet on wet. Then I'll show you the wet on dry. So let's go ahead and quickly fill in some of these petal shapes with water, as you know we do when we're working wet on wet. I'm going to not fill in the entire petal here, just that top section. And now this is the smaller brush, and I'm going to start dropping in some paint. And as you can see, it's kind of like your typical wet on wet. The thing is that I got this nice water brush loaded here with just water, and I can use this to guide my paint around without having to wash the paint out of my paintbrush, or the brush that's got all that nice rich pigment on here. So that ends up saving paint. It keeps my water cleaner because I'm not constantly washing my brush. But it also makes the process a little more streamlined because I'm not having to take the time to go wash my brush off. So I'm just refreshing the water a little on this shape. I'm going to do the exact same thing here. Just let that flow up. And then I'm going to show you how I'm going to use the same technique for adding some detail. So this one, as you can see, I started to create some creases and folds already, but as this continues to dry, I'm going to be able to add a few more. So I'm just going to add a little more pigment to my brush, and I'm just going to come with an up and down motion and just add a little bit of these creases and folds to this petal while it's still wet. Then I'm going to use, once again, my water brush, which I'm tapping off so it's not too wet. And I can use this to just guide that pigment around, and you can see it's picking up some of the pigment, but I can also do a little bit of lifting, remove some of the pigment, and just have a little bit more control, even while I'm working wet on wet, or as it's starting to dry, wet on damp. So I'll just very quickly fill in this petal doing the same technique, because I'm going to show you some wet on dry here in a minute. And I'm not going to add detail to this one, because this one will have wet on dry details. Let's repeat that on the leaf. So I'm just going to fill it in with water, as we usually do when we're working wet on wet. I haven't even quite come to the edges. I'm pretty close, but I haven't even fully filled the edges. I'm just going to grab another brush. Again, it really doesn't matter what size you use as your paint brush, but I'm going to pick up a softer brush this time. I'm going to just add a little bit of green to this and start painting the stem. I need a little more water. I can tell I'm a bit dry. I'm just going to come down here, drop in my pigment, and then I'm going to come around the edges. I could fill the whole thing in with a solid green if I wanted to, but I'm going to keep things a little bit more interesting and just fill the outside of this shape, and then just gently blend a little of the green into the center, and then I'll add some details once that's dry. Now this two brush technique is amazing when you're working wet on dry. Let me show you some ways that I use it. So in this case, say I'm working in a smaller shape, I can go ahead and just lay down a little bit of my pigment and then quickly come in with my water brush and just blend that around and tap a little off. And I'm able to achieve a beautiful gradation of dark to light with very little effort. Now, if I was to do this and have to wash my brush in between, say I use the same brush for the pigment and I have to wash my brush, then add the water. Sometimes that darker pigment has already dried and you end up with a hard edge. This is a technique I mainly use when I'm working in smaller shapes. The larger your shape is, the drying factor still comes in. You can end up having that little bit of pigment start drying too fast. And so this is a technique I use a lot when I'm working in smaller shapes. I do use wet on wet as well, but I'll also show you how you can use this wet on dry for some creases and folds. So with this little petal here, I'm gonna go ahead and do a few creases. Now you could use lighter pigment and then come in with your damp brush. I'm just gonna soften and blend those around. Wash and dry my brush because it's getting pigment now, and just kind of blend that. You can see that worked quite well for some like nice simple creases and folds in my flower petal. I'm going to tap a little of the pigment off because I'm quite concentrated in red, and just do a few light little veins here, creases. You can see that one got a little wet because my page was wet from blending here, but this one over here was dry, or the paper was dry, and I'm just blending it with my damp brush. So you can see that works really nicely. If you want to add some details, using that second brush allows you to very quickly come in and start softening your edges before your pigment gets too dry. So that can work really, really well. I do like my wet on wet / wet on damp details here, but you can always add more detail on top using the same method. So coming in, adding those on wet, on dry, and then my water brush, gotta wash it off again, and just quickly come in and blend those around. And as you can see, I've hardly ever washed my paintbrush here. My water remains much cleaner, and I'm washing way less paint down the drain. But even more than that, I feel like this is making the process of painting so much more efficient and smooth. I'm gonna go ahead and add some details now to my leaf with this darker green. I'm gonna start by painting this middle vein right here. Then I'm using my water brush and softening that edge. So once again, the same sort of technique I showed you here. I can work on this side of the leaf if I'm very careful to maintain just a very thin, light line, or just a dry line kind of here, where I'm gonna call that the center vein. So I'm just gonna come in here, I'm gonna do one vein, but again, not touching. And then I'm gonna just blend it into this side here beside it. So I'm gonna use my water brush, blend that out, try not to touch the other side of the leaf. And just blend that down to the bottom. So I'm washing and drying my water brush. I still have the pigment loaded on my paintbrush though. And I'm just gonna come in here and do another vein. And I'm gonna blend that around this time. Whoops. I'm gonna try to not quite touch this vein right here. So I'm gonna get a little bit of variety in my leaf. I'm gonna even add a little more. If I feel like I want more green, just tap a little more in here. You could also have left painted your original base layer a little bit darker too. I'm gonna come into here, do this vein, blend it around. Once again, softening that edge. I don't mind if the veins kind of touch each other at the base here. I don't mind if that all blends around. Just going wet, but I'm using my water brush to blend. And once again, I might throw a little more pigment, almost like a little bit of a wet on wet technique, just because I feel like it could have a little more green. You can see working with these two brushes, so efficient. And then I'm gonna come down here finally and just do a little bit more. Almost imagine there's just a bit more green down here, and I'll just blend that around. I'm not even really calling it a vein down here, just adding a little bit more pigment. And I've maintained that center vein. Once it's dry, I can come in and do the veins on this side. You know what I'm noticing? I'm getting a little bit of a funny edge here. So I'm just gonna blend this a little bit more. Once again, you can see I'm not really washing my brush too often because I've got paintbrush and water brush. There you can see I did sort of touch, my water touch, so I got a little bit of a bleed, but not too bad. I'm gonna dry this just so you can see me do this last half of this leaf. So I've gone ahead and dried it, and I'm just gonna finish up with this same technique. Sometimes you can even do more than one vein if you work fast enough. It's a little more of a risk to do two at once, but you can sometimes do that. Paint one, and then come down here and blend in the next one. That's a timing thing. If you are having your paint or your paper dry really quick, depending on your climate, you might just want to stick with doing one vein at a time. Some of it has to do with how quickly things are drying and how quickly you work, but it is convenient still to have these two brushes because, as you can see, I'm not washing my paintbrush off. And that's kind of nice because the paint on my brush is staying pretty consistent as I do this. Since I'm having so much fun with these wet on dry details, I'm going to carry on and do just a few more on this little petal here. So I'm just going to bring the little creases and folds kind of like this. I'm working kind of lightly right now. I have a little less. There we go. I was going to say less pigment on my brush. Not anymore. It's heavily pigmented. but I'm just going to do a little bit of this wet on dry and then blending it with my water brush, just so you can see how that works, just with different movements of my brush. You can also see that water allows me to come up. I can even kind of leave some of those streaks a little bit like a wet on dry. Then I'm going to show you how I use two brushes on a more complex piece. You can see I'm creating some separation between the petals by first applying some wet on dry with one brush. Then I come in with a second brush and soften that with water. And then once again, coming back in with my pigment brush just to add a little bit more color. I use this technique all the time in my more intermediate and my advanced work. Here I'm working wet on wet and adding just that little bit of color, and then once again blending it around. You can see how I've got both brushes in my hand at the same time. Sometimes I take this even a step further. Here you can see I'm painting a shadow shape using wet on dry, using a fairly deep purple. Then I come in with another brush with a little bit of blue, just tap that in, and then I switch back to my water brush to just bring in a little bit of water to create that look of the beautiful watercolor variation. And yes, you'll probably notice that my reference photo is much pinker than what I painted my violets, and that was intentional. I wanted to kind of go with a little more of a traditional violet color, and if you want to learn more about how I switch colors, I recently did a video on that. So I'll include a link for that in the description below. Here you can see I'm using a small paintbrush just to create some creases and folds in my violet petals. Then I come in with my water and just soften those. Creases and folds, and then softening. If you'd like to work alongside me as I paint this entire cluster of violets, you can find the full-length tutorial on my Etsy shop. I'll share with you how I created and maintained both a sense of cohesion throughout this entire cluster of flowers, as well as how I broke the cluster up into individual flowers and added depth and detail with my shadows and those beautiful creases and folds. You'll enjoy seeing how I use my two brushes in action as you work alongside me. If the depth and cohesion that you see in this cluster of flowers is something you feel ready for in your own work, I'd love to invite you to check this tutorial out on my Etsy shop and see if it's right for you. You'll receive lifetime access to the video tutorial and outline, so you can complete this at your own pace. For those of you who have subscribed to my free newsletter, you're welcome to email me with your work and ask questions along the way. You can find a link to that newsletter in the description below. I can't wait to see what you create. But you can also find plenty of free tutorials for beginner and intermediate level artists on my channel, where I help you advance your skills one technique and one painting at a time. In the meantime, I hope this tutorial has brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye!